Genshin Impact? More like Genshin Impact? Sorry, I needed to get it out of the way before we got started. Genshin Impact is a gacha open world RPG released on September 28th, 2020 by Chinese game company MiHoYo, now HoYoverse, previously known for gacha ARPG Honkai Impact. With its marketing and general reputation as the free-to-play Breath of the Wild up to that point, along with official releases on PC and consoles, Genshin was able to gain 10 million pre-registrations, and only a month after its launch had grossed $245 million. Genshin is easily the largest gacha game currently in service, and the fourth largest grossing gacha ever, only beat out by FGO, Puzzles & Dragons, and Monster Strike, because of course. A lot of Genshin's popularity can be attributed to its open-world gameplay and ease of access to mainstream gamers. While you either need to download an app that takes half your phone's storage space, or use an emulator that eats up your RAM to play a lightweight mobile game, for Genshin you just play the game normally. Hell, considering how badly it runs on most phones, I'd say it is explicitly not a mobile game. This, along with any notion that it could be anything close to Breath of the Wild's design, allowed Genshin to cast a much wider net for its initial player base. This also meant that HoYoverse would be aiming for players outside the general gacha space. Definitely won't have major ramifications for later. Of course, Genshin has been subject to major controversy, lack of responsibility regarding IRL collabs, anniversary gifts, security issues, Orientalism, harassment, the normal thing you'd expect from any gacha really. But the thing that's super interesting about all of this is how it's made major waves of the community, and yet none of them were actually fixed at the root. At best, patched. And it's come to this point where the lack of changes has become so normalized that it feels like a genuine surprise when they do anything that responds to major criticism. At time of writing, Genshin is at its first half of version 3.3, having released 24 limited banners and 2 new regions along with a number of smaller areas in the little over 2 years of service. It also marks about half a year since I stopped playing. I feel like it's important to give you a proper view of my background with this game, as well as fulfill my own personal need to validate the hours I put into a game that I don't really like anymore. I started playing Genshin within the first month of release, and had been playing pretty consistently up till the start of 2.8. I have about a year's worth of Welkins under my belt, and I tended to min-max teams that involve my faves as much as possible. Data mines were the only real parts of fandom that I followed, as that's just kind of my norm when I play these games. Abyss was the only real challenge for me because I refused to change teams for different chambers, and for most of my time there, my teams were relatively static. From the start, I thought the game itself was okay, something worth my playtime, but also nothing I'd really write home about. Like a lot of players, I was there mostly for the Breath of the Wild-like aspects. I got through the story, did my dailies, and cried over artifact rolls. So really the general endgame experience. Even as my opinion of the game worsened, I kept playing on the daily up till I hit my breaking point, but even then, there were still parts of the game that were actually fun. Genshin's gameplay can be pretty easily split between overworld exploration and combat challenges. Let's start with the former. This is what the game was basically marketed around, a free roam open world to explore and find cool things in. This is mostly where you're going to be when content updates come around. Explore, complete puzzles, read the story whether you like it or not, do some combat, and all those sorts of things. While this aspect of the game isn't really the main focus of this video, it's good to mention the actual quality of these parts. It's pretty good. No, really. Even if you call it a Breath of the Wild clone, doing that and doing it okay is good enough to get a stamp of approval from me. In the low pressure environments of the overworld, combat can be a lot more loose, and you're just able to fool around with your abilities in ways you can't in Abyss. The world design allows for plenty of exploration, and being able to see the vast landscapes is always nice to see. While I wouldn't consider the world dense, there is certainly something in most places you'll find yourself in. Oh, and hey, doing all these things gives you primos, that's neat. Music's nice. That's about it. No major upsides, no real complaints about it. Unfortunately, this is all the straight praise I can give the game. From here on, it's a lot of okay, a lot of compromises, a lot of mid. The combat chambers themselves are actually where you're going to be spending most of your time in Genshin. Events, minigames, combat chambers. Materials, combat chambers. Endgame grind, combat chambers. And most of the time, the actual goal is the exact same. Kill these enemies under this time limit, and that's it. Environmental mechanics exist, but does anyone actually pay attention to those? Aside from that fucking ice talent domain, fucking hell, screw that place. In a vacuum, that would be fine, but then when you consider the sheer amount you'll be doing it, it starts to look less and less fun. Just to get it all done as fast as possible, you'll likely be using the exact same teams in the exact same way to get through it all, and as more of these come out, it becomes easier and easier to see the lack of variety in the enemy design. Okay, the issue with enemy design isn't necessarily that all the enemies are samey. There are a good number of enemies that do different things. The issue is that regardless of their differences, you'll likely be doing the exact same thing except dodge in a different way. No thoughts, head empty, Q, E, kill. Bosses are generally a mixed bag. A lot of mechanics revolve around having a specific element, and not in the you'll gain a significant advantage if you use this element kind of way, but rather the use this element or this fight will last 5 minutes longer than it should kind of way. The actually well-designed bosses are the ones that don't do this, and instead have something unique that keeps you on your toes. Thunder Manifestation, the Coral Defenders, and the Primo Geofishaps to an extent are all fights that are actually interesting when you take your time with them. Unfortunately, all of them also fall under the Q, E, kill kind of strategy. The story itself is like, it's fine. It conveys characters, it does what it needs to, but like, that's it. There's no real bite to the writing. The only bits of the main story that actually got me interested were the Leeway arc and the Darkslip quests, and that's because they actually considered the greater world of Teyvat. They had some sort of cohesive theme as a through line for the whole arc, and just generally considered things that were outside the immediate situation. The character stories are really the best example of what I mean with Genshin's writing quality. The actual writing on screen is fine, and we get to know the characters well, but they really just boil down to the traveler hanging out with a highlight character for the day. Nothing actually happens to them. They just go about their normal day, but also travelers there. Events of major significance to either the character or the larger world rarely happen. The event stories don't fare much better. These stories have a much better chance at exploring characters in more depth, and quite a few do. Multiple stories delve into the character's past and explore how the character ended up in the place that they are now, or maybe just a story of a completely new character who disappears, who knows. It gives them a lot more depth, yes, but like, what about now? As much as we learn about these people, it does nothing to actually consider what the character will be doing from here on. Characters end up feeling like they've already had their character arcs finished before we had any chance to even witness it. All we get to see is their destination, and only maybe parts of their journey. The only characters I remember having been able to escape this were Raiden and Albedo, both of which threaten you with more interesting developments rather than deciding to definitively conclude their arcs, which, yeah, to be expected. And all that doesn't even consider the timings of all the story that happens. Serious event stories happen maybe once a patch cycle, which is honestly a good pace, but I think the real issue is with how there's absolutely no sense of time between everything. Unfortunately, that's just a result of the clash between open world design and live service practices. but it's still a problem when I'm entering Sumeru and learning how Kole has a life-threatening disease, and then the next day Paimon just wants to go back to Inazuma for a week to hang out with her buds. Putting it all together, it's almost as if the world itself is in a state of stasis, that no matter how much you actually do, no matter how much the societies you visit are changed by the events of the story, nothing actually materially changes. The world upheaves, major players reveal themselves, and the Fatui continue to come closer to achieving their goals, and yet it feels like nothing's actually happening. The changes we see are surface level at best. People will recount past events on occasion, and people can show up in places they couldn't before, but the actual world around them is at a standstill. On the rare case that the writing feels like it takes place in a dynamic world, it actually feels fulfilling. In particular, I want to highlight Yoimiya and Kokomi's character stories specifically, both of them taking place during and after the Inazuma arc, respectively. By involving the actual happenings of the world at that time, the stories feel much more impactful, that something significant actually happened, rather than the world just being the same as it was yesterday. Even if they're smaller stories, they show the effects of the world around them, which makes everything feel much more cohesive. Overall, the writing in Genshin makes it feel like any work you've done up to that point had no effect. That for all you do, nothing actually fundamentally changes. Also in writing this, I learned that you can't even replay quests like at all. It's why I've been using other people's videos for the b-roll. I literally cannot get it myself. And why do the characters talk like you've been friends for years when you've known them for like a month at best, and literally a day at worst? Screw characters that like you and trust you wholeheartedly. I want characters that hate your guts for what you've done to them. Play Arknights. Wait, hold on, what was I talking about? Geez, I went on a major tangent there. Okay, so once we finish all the story and we've explored all the places that we want to go to, what's left? Just the basic dailies and progression farming, right? Genshin is the Fortnite of Gacha, and Genshin is the BBC Sherlock of Gacha. No, I will not elaborate. So far, this video has been a general criticism of Genshin, discussing the game's major design issues while acknowledging its positive aspects. That part of the video is done. From here on is a descent into madness about how a game got away with being one of the most exploitative gachas I've seen in my years. Just as a note before we keep going, I'm going to be writing this primarily with the endgame, as in Air 45 Plus player in mind. This is the group that I believe is the main target for these practices, as well as the money cow for Hoyoverse, and because it's been at least 2 years since I was progressing AR, and I remember nothing about what it was like. The grind never ends. Now, actually progressing characters to the level cap is slow, but considering the roster, team sizes, and intervals you'll be getting new characters, it makes sense at the very least. Artifacts do not. Artifacts are horrible. Vile even. Just ignoring the actual math behind it, or what we would consider a good artifact, having at minimum 4 entire layers of RNG behind it is a bad move no matter how you put it. I don't really think I need to explain all the bad parts of artifact farming. If you've done it, you already know. It's a frankly awful system that extends the endgame farm for a particular character as far as it can possibly go. In terms of its actual place in the gameplay, it's also terrible. Artifacts ultimately define a character's power, to the point where combat in general is impossible without them, which forces you to engage with the awful multi-layer gacha. Slapping on the right main stats is enough for general content, but take a step into Abyss and you'll be wanting to min-max every single artifact you get a shot at. There's the argument that this is a positive, saying that it allows even the starting roster to help clear later Abyss levels, and brings the gap between rarities much lower than it could have been. And that's true in a way, but I would have to ask, is that actually good design? Is restricting the ability to play anyone in the roster in what's supposed to be general endgame content behind a statistic system with multiple layers of stamina and random systems okay? No, it's not. Additionally, as the meta progresses and the amount of possible combat situations grow, players need to raise more and more characters to adapt. Either that, or suffer. But while getting characters to whatever standard a player wants has some sort of maximum time needed, getting a character's artifact set may take an infinite amount of runs due to the RNG nature of the system. The time needed to raise is already long, and adding in artifacts makes it so that multiple Abyss cycles can go by before you can even get a set that's comparable to the other characters you've already spent months working on. And by then, it's likely that we moved on to the next banner cycle, and the Abyss's focuses have changed, and unless it was someone that could potentially be in your main teams, the chances you'll be getting to use them aren't very high. If it's someone that's more niche or in an unsupported element for the cycle, all you can do is shrug and hope that the next abyss goes more in your favor. When you get a progression cycle that takes longer than the meta content cycle, what you end up with is wasted time. Resin is a pain. That's not a surprise. All stamina systems are a pain. But Genshin takes the extra step to make it sting just a little bit more, that makes it go from an annoyance to something intolerable. And it's for quite a simple reason: active farming. To get the stuff you need, you have to actually head over to the domains and fight in them for however long it'll take to finish, up to 4 times in a row, even with condensed resin. There is no getting around that. You have to spend 5 to 10 minutes on the daily, at least twice a day, just to do everything you need as part of the grind. On top of that, you need to do your commissions, which takes another 10 minutes. And it only gets worse if you're fighting for artifacts. When you're just upgrading a character directly, you do the domain and upgrade when you have the right mats. When artifact farming, the time you're spending outside is about the same as your time spending inside the domain. Collect butterflies for condensed resin, convert them, go to and finish the domain multiple times. Check out the artifacts you get, level the ones you want, and pray you get the right substat rolls. Compare them with your current sets to see if it's better. Cry because it's not. It's a pain. It turns dailies from a casual check-in to a fucking chore. The only real plus is the fact that they did up the cap from 120 to 160. Back then, overcapping your resin was an actual bottleneck in your progression. God! Now, normally, being rewarded with gacha currency in a variety of spaces is a normal thing. Something encouraged within the genre even. But Genshin ends up making it pervasive. These little things are everywhere. It's essentially the default reward for anything that happens. As an example, for gachas at large, rewards for the daily mission set might include some basic currency, some materials, and a bit of gacha currency. But for Genshin, the gacha currency is the main reward. Your goal for logging in and doing commissions isn't to progress your characters or even get some materials, it's to farm for gacha. And that's the real issue with this sort of design. You're constantly being reminded of the gacha, to the point where even if you're enjoying a different part of the game, it'll end up being in the back of your mind just from being constantly in your face. Doing story quests? Hey, here's a third of a pull. Exploring? Literally every chest gives you at least one. Playing the event minigames? The most basic missions in those, give them. It's come to the point where I feel like if they added an area or an event that just didn't give any primos, it'd just feel uncanny. Overall, Genshin feels like the culmination of gacha practices. A gacha game designed by the people that grew up seeing how other people reacted to gacha games. A game specifically engineered to perfect every way to keep players playing, and to keep them in the system to make sure they can milk every single dollar possible. Typically, when I consider whether or not I'm wasting my time in a live service game, I ask myself, if all the daily missions, all the in-game rewards, all the little practices that keep me coming in day by day just up and disappeared, what would I still come in for? What else would I play for? And for Genshin, as I continue to see the live service reasonings behind the design decisions, that list continues to grow smaller and smaller. Everything comes back to the money. Everything comes back to the... And before we get started with this section, yes, all gacha is predatory. If you haven't heard, gacha is designed to push people to spend as much money on the gacha as possible. That's their business model. And it's important for all players to be aware of that when considering spending real money and real time on these games. That being said, Genshin's gacha is the strangest I've ever seen. At best, it can be seen as this weird design made to work with the game's actual gameplay systems, and at worst, it's the greediest gacha I've ever had to interact with, only maybe beat out by FGO rates. Okay, we're about to get number crunchy here, so turn on your STEM brains. Let's get our basic facts out of the way. All major banners are limited, as well as the highlight character. We have a 0.6 5-star rate with a 90 pull hard pity. With any 5-star, we have a 50-50 chance to get the highlight character. If that roll fails, the next 5-star is guaranteed to be the highlight character. Adding more complexities like primo income, roster size, or if soft pity exists at all, makes it much more difficult to evenly compare the system with other gachas, which we'll be doing soon. So, if we simulate this basic system, and by simulate I mean run literally 20 lines of Python code, we get these stats. That was a shitty snap. Now let's put this into perspective. For comparison, I'll be using Arknights, which has a relatively similar rate of system, as well as Ground Blue and World Flipper as representatives for Spark systems over pity systems. For sparking simulations, once the pull hits the spark limit, we get a free rate up without any pulls needed. This also gives a slight advantage, as it assumes that all pulls will eventually lead us to a spark, which isn't always the case in real life. Now, why am I using these as the examples over other gachas, like the Fire Emblem gacha or the Dragon Ball gacha? I think you can guess. Okay, let's take a look at the results. I'll take a moment to clarify things in this table. So, Arknights and World Flipper have different rates for different banner types. I put all of the types in the same cell in the same order as the list in the header row. Additionally, the numbers in parentheses are the rates for a specific character in the general rate up pool, as there can be multiple. All these numbers are from the simulation, so they already cover pity, spark systems, and all that nonsense. Actually, this may be better to understand if I format it into the average pull count rather than rates. There. Much less abstract. Much more reality to confront. Now, what do all these numbers actually mean? Okay, firstly, for anyone who isn't following me on the math, this does not mean you should be expecting an SSR once you hit that amount of pulls in that top row. These numbers represent the overall averages, not individual expectations. A specific pull session can vary wildly, as anyone that watches pull videos can attest to. Secondly, to no surprise at all, Genshin's SSR rate is awful. We're seeing a little over double the amount of pulls to get to a 5-star compared to third place, Arknights. But the really interesting thing here is the fact that Genshin is also the easiest to get a specific rate up character. Look at that third row. Genshin's average SSR to rate up is extremely low, the next lowest being World Flipper's single rate up banner, which is a little over double Genshin's. Doesn't take many tries at an SSR to get who you want in Genshin. And I think it's the combination of those two facts that really makes for the core of how Genshin's gacha system has made it this far, and how it's grown to these heights. And to explain it, we need to take a step back and reflect on what it's actually like to experience gacha games. When you pull in these sorts of games, what's your actual goal? The character you want, right? Given the pulls you need, you'll ultimately stop once you get them, or max or dupes if you're insane, and just stop there. How do you feel about getting other characters, especially ones that aren't rate up? What about ones that you've already maxed out? Put off? Discouraged even? The fact of the matter is that quite a few people just decide to take the L if they pull a significant amount, and still end up with people that they didn't want. So, what if we made a system to avoid that situation? Make sure that players pull as much as they can, with confidence that when they get that rainbow pull, it's the character that they've been looking for this whole time. Well, that's Genshin. When you pull one of the perma characters, you don't shrug and say, well, there goes my shot. You go, okay, here's my guarantee, I should keep going, I still have a chance. There's no need to worry about getting another perma character, nor could you put it off on the chance that you could off-banner them, because that doesn't exist in Genshin. And that difference in player mindset is critical in the psychological traps that Gacha uses to push players to spend money. The more a player is willing to pull, the more they're willing to spend. Remember, that's always what it's about. What Genshin has done is increase the price, but lower the risks, just enough to make it so that it's still a gamble, just to milk out that little bit of gambling serotonin. Meanwhile, players end up so ecstatic that they've gotten the character that they wanted, that they don't realize that they gave up more money for a lesser reward overall. This design is also why I think Genshin's gacha is defended so fervently by some. Aside from a lot of people just not knowing how predatory gacha is at its core, remember that Genshin is a lot of people's first and only gacha. The ease of getting the rate up makes the gacha seem like it's being more generous. After all, it only took them 1 or 2 shots at the 5-star to get the one that they wanted, unaware of the exorbitant price to take a shot in the first place. Alright, let's backtrack a bit. The actual writing on screen is fine, and we get to know the characters well, but they really just boil down to the traveler hanging out with a highlight character for the day. Nothing actually happens to them. They just go about their normal day, but also travelers there. This is what all that comes back to. Character appeal. They want you to like a character. They do everything in their power to get you attached to them, to go the extra mile to make sure that you know that they're at your side for your journey. Then, they point at the banner and say, hey, it's really easy to get your fave, don't worry, just $200 and they're yours. Guaranteed. Anything that involves the characters, main story, events, side stories, don't just reeks of them being sold to players rather than exploring their situations and personalities. It's why they feel largely static. It's why their arcs feel mostly completed by the time you meet them. It's why their designs look like they're made in a lab for mass appeal. Yeah, I said it. And It works! It worked on me for a year and a half. It all comes back to the gacha, and everyone's exposed to it. So what makes Genshin worse than other gachas in this aspect? Isn't this whole idea about appealing characters to players so that they're encouraged to pull for them just the norm? Well, yeah, obviously. These design decisions aren't really anything revolutionary. We've seen these in other forms all over the gacha space, and it's important to be aware of them and to consider your own view of them so you can avoid these traps. But Genshin is, once again, the culmination of all these practices. A refined, perfected combination of all the things that turns games into money-making machines. And I feel like I'm going insane when I think about Genshin's design choices with this mindset. Things start lining up in a way that makes this whole thing feel like a conspiracy. It's why they have such little investment in the NPCs. They're not going to make us money, so why work on them? It's why the hangouts are modeled after dating sims. They're a crystallized form of the event story's goals that they can push out on the side without interrupting everything else. It's why the cast size is so small. They can put out more time in the characters coming out soon for more appeal. It's to this point where I can't tell anymore what's a genuine game design decision and what's just a choice made for money. Okay. All of this is ultimately for people that pull for character appeal, specifically. What about the meta first players? No debate, no argument. Constellations are the worst dupe system I've seen in my years. Usually when dupe systems have major power-ups within them, there's some sort of replacement item that can be farmed for regularly, or at the very least something that allows players to get them without pulling. This does not exist in Genshin. It's only dupes. It's only gacha. A system that can't be directly influenced by any in-game activity, and yet can massively change characters. Now the actual constellations themselves. They frankly make the game's power scaling go from pretty good to absolutely abysmal. It's to the point where a single constellation can fundamentally change both the value and playstyle of a character. Even the lower constellations can be major game changers for a character's power. Hu Tao C1, Raiden C2, Kazuha C2. And the C6s are just absolutely stupid sometimes. Ganyu, Ayaka, Yalan. Insanely powerful boosts that are locked exclusively behind the gacha. It's blatantly greedy design obviously made to round up the rest of the player base and lure them into potential money spending. For anyone looking into power or meta, you are incredibly incentivized to go for constellations on top of the character itself, which we've already seen is harder to do than it should. Okay, tangent over, let's bring back the table real quick. Now, let's convert the values to their actual price tags. For clarity, all the exchange rates are based on the game's respective highest price standard packs without any bonuses, except for Granblue, which uses a direct to yen conversion with multiple middlemen services. I'll be using Mobige's pricing for them. Also because Japan's economy is a bit whack right now. I'll keep them as yen for the primary data. The dollar conversion will be in brackets. It's as we discussed before. Higher bar to entry, lower bar to finish. And also, all gachas are like this to some extent. Holy shit, do you see some of those prices? There is a lot to how gachas in general exploit our minds to make us give out cash, and even me listing out these prices might contribute to it, because there are definitely packs in these games with much more value, and you might think you should get those because they're good deals. And guess what? That's also part of the trick. That's one of the main strategies in how they get money out of people, by obscuring the actual value of what you're going to be spending on. At the end of it all, it comes back to this row, and how much we value it. Actually, there. It's all about what we should be paying attention to more, about what's more important. Getting a thing, or getting the thing you wanted. From a purely objective view, Genshin is the worst. Double the price tag, dear god. But if all you care about is getting the person you want, and nothing else, Genshin might just be the best. And if your first scotch is Genshin, it's likely that they convince you that the second row is more important than the first. But it's not. You are paying more for less. I want to stress right now that paying $200 for only the character you like and maybe one other person is not a good deal, even by gacha standards. Before we close out this section, it's good to remind you, the one watching this right now, are probably not the actual moneymaker whales that any live service game is targeting. Their focus is on the whales, the people that either won't, or can't, stop spending money on these games. All you are is a tag-along, maybe a cheerleader, maybe a minor moneymaker, with the potential to join their main target. Here's a question I'd like to ask everyone that still plays Genshin. What about the game has fundamentally changed in the last 2 years of service? And by that, I don't mean content specifically, those are a category all on their own. I mean additional systems, quality of life changes, or new mechanics that change the way you interact with the general space. Off the top of my head, there's the resin improvements, artifact transmutation, and the general idea of environmental danger maybe. You know, the things like in Dragonspire, the Chasm, the Withering. I'd say that the poison debuff and the new dendro reactions might count, but minor things like Yelan's full HP scaling kit don't. Now, with that list, how much of it actually affects you right now? The Withering is limited to certain areas in Sumeru, and the other environmental effects are also in specific places that may or may not be irrelevant to someone. They're also fairly individualized, meaning that knowing one won't help you out with another. Yelan's kit does set precedents for later kits, but the actual process of artifact farming and raising is still the same. You may just want to keep a bigger pool for possible hits. The real fundamental changes that I'm looking for right now are the things that change the way you interact with the game. So really all we have left are the quality of life changes. Everything else is some sort of limited content or mechanics in some way. Now, if the devs treat the new thing as part of the new default or on some sort of rotation, that'd be one thing, and hopefully that's what Dendro will be. But most other things are treated as limited. The corrosion debuff could fall either way. It was the new thing in Inazuma, but so far at least I haven't seen it in Sumeru, and whether or not it comes back will be up to them. In what you consider an average environment in the game, a standard fight, barely any of the things that the developers have made will actually appear. And that's what I'm ultimately coming down to. The game's base layer of mechanics has changed very little. Literally when I re-downloaded the game to record footage, I was doing the exact same thing as when I left. I used the same strategies in Abyss, I was doing the same events in the exact same way, my dailies were the exact same, and I'm still farming the Severed Fates domain. Now, what would fundamental changes actually look like? Well, for general combat chamber style content, it'd be rotating mechanics. Things that aren't constant, but always on the periphery to keep players on their toes. But the easiest way to do it would be global changes in the overworld. You know those new dash points all around Sumeru to help travel? Yeah, put those everywhere, including old areas. The little wind bugs in Mondstadt, I don't remember the name. Keep using them, things like that. Things that help change how we interact with the world on the average, rather than in specific cases. The kind of specific area design the game has now isn't actively bad, but it points to a much more root problem with the game. And by that, I mean it looks like the developers really don't care about improving the game that now defines their company. And I do seriously mean this. There are count them two, times that the developers responded to player feedback in a timely manner. Zhongli's rebalance and the anniversary rewards. Now, why did they fix these complaints specifically, when there are plenty of other complaints they could be working on? Because they got so big, it could have significantly affected their profits. Zhongli was an Archon, and probably expected to make big sales. So seeing all this uproar and an extremely underperforming banner compared to Venti, of course they had to buff him. It was the quickest way to settle the controversy, and encourage players to pull for meta reasons if he was just straight up busted. And for Anniversary, if your fanbase starts attacking the entire App Store, something's wrong. You gotta take care of that. There's no way that isn't gonna affect your company. This thing was already discussed thoroughly when it first came out, and it's obvious why. Like, holy crap, even I was not expecting something that bad to come from the devs. The whole thing just feels like one giant bra moment. And while it would be fun to go through question by question and make fun of the devs, plenty of people have already done that, so I want to point out the ones that are important to us right now. First we have the endgame content question. I think this one is the most famous for being absolutely bad, but it really does signal to us the main issue with Genshin's future development. They just straight up aren't thinking about content that goes with the systems that they already have. Rather, they want to make completely separate systems with the base game as a hub. And really? They literally already have the tools to make content like this from events. They can just change those up a bit and make them into permanent versions. They don't even need rewards. Just make something that's relevant to your main systems. Please. I do not care how fun the TCG is. I want something that's relevant to the main systems of your game that's already fun. Okay, this one's a bit of a give and take. Yes, a lot of characters have well-settled niches that allow for further changes in current combat encounters to bring them back. But also, when exactly do those changes happen? Going by Abyss, the answer is very obvious. It's when the banner changes. It's very apparent by how the Abyss passive caters to the current running characters' kits that they just want to pressure players to pull. Combat in more common areas like the overworld or events are designed to cater to any team, so they don't even apply to this situation. It's ultimately the forcing of meta changes in favor of the company's wallet that allows characters to come back in the first place. And even then, a large amount of characters are just straight up power creeped. Even with the possible changes that they could do, unless they make the changes very, very character specific, it's likely that either the meta team will just out-DPS them still, or that a different team can reap the benefits better than the target character. Why would anyone use Xiao when Red and National can still beat out his time? Sorry, Xiao fans. It's good to be reminded sometimes that these guys actually do know how to do game design. Complexity is not the same as depth of gameplay, and there are definitely good ways to increase the latter without increasing the former. No major criticism here. I just felt like I needed to throw him a bone. Lol. That's all I have to say. Okay, this one is genuinely interesting to think about, both because of how vague it is, and how they actually definitively state that they're planning on improving the game. This could vary from just a quality of life change by letting people read the story, hopefully they also implement story skip by then, to reintroducing old rewards in some way, which may allow for some fast forwarding of early game progression. Or maybe it'll be neither, and Genshin will prove itself resistant to fundamental change once again. Who knows? You probably know which one I'll be expecting. By 2.8, I was fairly burnt out with the game. The rush of Yelan's release had passed, and I was back to numbly going through the motions when the Sumeru trailer first came out. Like I mentioned before, one of the main reasons I kept playing was for new areas, the exploration aspect with characters that I enjoyed playing. But when I saw that trailer, my first thought wasn't, wow, this area looks cool, I wonder what it's gonna be like exploring it, but rather, oh god, this looks like a nightmare to find all the chests in. And that was when I realized that instead of enjoying the game for what it actually was, my primary motivation was saving for the gacha. Not the story, not even my faves, just the gambling. So I left. Nothing else to do there. But I still play gacha games. I still play them, knowing how exploitive they are at the core. They're games that I would enthusiastically play if their gacha systems were just completely removed and the game kept running as normal. Right now, I play Grand Blue Fantasy, World Flipper, and Arknights. As a person with disposable income and no other hobbies, I decide to buy the monthly packs and Syptixes, those packs that guarantee a specific unit. Grand Blue has an in-depth grid and battle system, as well as an interesting world that I find engaging even after 4-5 years of playing, even if the grind is hell. World Flipper is something that I generally have low commitment to, but the pixel art style is very cute, and the absolute batshit pinball gameplay is fucking hilarious. And Arknights, well... So, is it okay to keep playing Genshin? No. Okay. Generally, you're fine if you want to keep playing. There is still something there after all. Just be wary of what Hoyoverse does and what you're doing as you play. Think about whether a system is made to be fun or if it's made to keep you playing. About what the devs do and why they do them. Think about how they want your money, not you. I've seen people, myself included, stick onto live service games for all sorts of reasons, from sticking with favorite characters to loss aversion to pure spite. It's ultimately up to you to decide when you've had enough, but I hope you'll allow me one last thing. This is a statement to all players of any live service game. It is okay to not play, but still follow along with the game's developments and story. You can still see the characters whenever you want. Walkthroughs and streams exist for a reason. You can experience the world without ever having to touch the actual game. This isn't a game where the play experience is fundamentally different from the watching experience. This isn't the original one-shot from 2014. Genshin is the largest gacha ever, and it doesn't seem to show signs of slowing down. I could hope that with their massive success, they take major steps to innovate or improve the game for everyone. But they've already told us that they just plan on doing the bare minimum. And really, that in and of itself should show how Hoyoverse views Genshin.